Do you get stuck on the last step of adding bindings to your quilts? Do you have trouble getting the ends to meet and lay flat when you attach binding? I'm Andy from True Blue Quilts, where we enjoy, experiment, and excel as we quilt. In this video, I will show you how to attach a traditional binding to the Dancing 9-Patch quilt. Let's get started. Here is a simple formula to remember how long to make your binding. You will generally have to sew several strips together. So to find the total length you need to know the perimeter of your quilt. And then I always add 20 to account for those seam allowances when I sew strips together. So I'm going to take 2 times the length, add 2 times the width, that gives me 4 sides to my quilt, and then add the 20 inches. So let's say we have a quilt that is 60 by 70. So multiplying by 2, I would have 120 plus 140, and then I'm going to add 20 more. So that's 260, 280. And then I take that 280 to get my strips. I'm going to have to divide by 40 because your fabric is usually about 40 to 42 inches wide. I'm going to use caution there, so divide by 40, and that tells me I need 7 strips. So when I take my fabric to the cutting table, I can cut 7 strips, and I will have enough length when I sew them together to attach that around the perimeter of my quilt. And that is the basic math you need to do for getting your binding ready for a To sew long strips together, you need to lay the ends facing each other, so right sides together, and then sew across the corner. So place your pins as shown in the photo and then sew in between. You do not want to sew across the corner and into that L shape. That's the wrong direction to make the fabric turn and lay in a flat strip. I am making the long strip, so I'm just laying the ends of the fabric right sides together, eyeballing that 1/4 inch overlap, and then trimming the dog ears. Next, we have to press our strip. So I fold it in half with the wrong side of the fabric to the insides. Obviously, you're going to be sewing the cut edge and leave the folded edge loose so that you can hand sew or machine sew that to your quilt. Sewing the binding strip to your quilt, I am using a regular presser foot with the 1/4 inch guide on it and just going around all sides of my quilt. Okay, I have sewn my binding strip all around the quilt, and I need to join the 2 ends. So things you need a pair of scissors, you need a small ruler, and you're going to need some pins. So when I started the binding, I left about 10 inches, and then I sewed so that I have about 10-15 inches. I have a good long distance there because I'm going to need to maneuver this quilt around. So I folded this strip. If you had enough room, you could just use the end there, but I don't want to rip back my binding for that distance. So I'm going to fold this binding strip and I finger press it, and that's where I need my scissors. I am going to trim that binding right there, as straight a cut as you can manage. Then I am going to overlap the other half of my binding strip, and you need to offset those a little bit, because what you want to do is you want to measure from the bottom side where that overlap is. You want to make that the exact width of your binding. So I always start with 2 1/4 inch strips. So I need my overlap to be 2 1/4 inches. So I've got that measured. I can crease it or eyeball it, mark it with a pin, and I'm going to trim that again as straight as possible. Done with the scissors, done with the ruler, done with that little bit of batting or binding strip. So now I'm going to have to sew these two together, and I want to make one continuous strip. So these need to be face down, or right sides together. That's where I said you need to maneuver. So it's really nice to have that much distance between your pieces. So just trying to decide. I don't think it really matters which one is on top, which one is on the bottom. So I am going to take the left-hand strip, lay it so that the right side is facing. I've taken that, I've just kind of done a half turn to put that wrong side down. Then the other strip, same thing, I'm keeping it straight, and I am opening it up so that it is face down on top. I'm going to place those 2 pins and then move to the sewing machine. That is my 1/4 inch that I'm eyeballing there. If you have a purple fang tool, you can measure that to make sure those overlap. And again, you're sewing across the strips, not into the corner. So I place my pins and I'm going to sew parallel right in between those pins. Okay, I have my fabric. You can see it's kind of a arm wrestle there with the quilt, and you just want to bunch up the quilt to the side of your machine and give yourself enough room so that that area is flat. And I'm going to sew right across. Take out my pins, and you can see that that now is a flat strip straight across. So I want to trim off the excess triangles. So again, you can just eyeball that parallel with the seam that you just have sewn. Trim off those little dog ears and finger press that seam so it's flat inside there, less bulk, and then just straighten out your quilt, and then you can overlap those stitches, stitch that straight down. You should not have very much bulk. Occasionally there may be a little tuck in there where that didn't line up exactly perfectly, But let me get this so that it lays flat under my machine, and we'll stitch down those last few inches of our binding. Okay, I'm getting close to where I started stitching, so I'm just going to run right over that line of stitching, back stitch a couple stitches, and my binding is all attached. Usually I attach binding to the front first. I don't know what I was thinking today, but I stitched it to the back. So that gives me a design opportunity, and I will show this in the next step close up. I'm going to bring my fabric around to the front, and I'm just going to do a decorative zigzag right next to that fold, and so that zigzag will show on the front of my quilt, but it does the job of attaching that binding down. So let me get started on that. I am wrapping the binding around the edge of the quilt and pinning it in place before I stitch the binding down. Again, I'm using a zigzag stitch to overlay the binding on top of my quilt. It's important to label your quilts. This becomes very useful for later generations, that you get that quilt that's been passed down through your family. So there's several options. You can buy pre-printed fabric labels like I've done here with this Quilts of Valor label, or you can just take a plain piece of fabric and write the details on that. Everyone will appreciate knowing who made the quilt and add the year at a minimum. Binding is the final step, so I'm anxious to see if you have made a dancing 9-patch quilt. Share on social media and tag True Blue Quilts, or email me a picture of your quilt. I'd love to see it. If you missed any of the steps in the construction of this dancing 9-patch quilt, please click on the playlist below, and I'd appreciate it if you would subscribe to this channel using the button on the right-hand side of your screen, so you never miss any of the True Blue Quilts videos where we enjoy, experiment, and excel as we quilt. See you next time.